On Tuesday, Israel launched a wave of airstrikes on Gaza, ending a 2-month ceasefire with Hamas. These attacks were the most intense since the ceasefire began on January 19th. According to the Palestinian Ministry of Health, at least 404 people were killed and 562 wounded in the strikes. Here is how the world is reacting to Israel's war on Gaza. Hamas, the governing authority of Gaza, condemned Israel's actions, calling it a unilateral cancellation of the ceasefire. Hamas spokesperson Izzat al-Rishek claimed that Israel's decision to resume hostilities would sacrifice prisoners taken during the October 7, 2023 attacks on Israel. In Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office announced that the operation was open-ended, with expectations for it to expand. The Israeli government claimed that the operation was launched after Hamas refused to release Israeli hostages and rejected proposals from U.S. presidential envoy Steve Witkoff.
Hamas is responsible for this war. It invaded our towns, murdered our people, raped our women, and kidnapped our loved ones. Hamas refused offer after offer to release our hostages. In the past 2 weeks, Israel did not initiate any military action in the hope that Hamas would change course. Well, that didn't happen. While Israel accepted the offer of President Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, Hamas flatly refused to do so. And this is why I authorized yesterday the renewal of military action against Hamas. Israel does not target Palestinian civilians. We target Hamas terrorists. And when these terrorists embed themselves in civilian areas, when they use civilians as human shields, they're the ones who are responsible for all unintended casualties. Palestinian civilians should avoid any contact with Hamas terrorists. And I call on the people of Gaza, get out of harm's way, move to safer areas. Because every civilian casualty is a tragedy. And every civilian casualty is the fault of Hamas. I thank President Trump for his unwavering support for Israel. Our alliance with the United States has never been stronger. To those who criticize Israel, I ask, what would you do if terrorists murdered and kidnapped your children? You would do what we are doing. In the face of pure evil, free societies have no choice but to fight. So I want to assure all our friends around the world, Israel will fight and Israel will win. We will bring our people home and we will destroy Hamas. We will not relent until we achieve all these vital goals. And we will not rest until we give our country a future of peace, prosperity, and hope.
In the United States, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt confirmed that Israel had consulted the Trump administration before launching the strikes.
Well, the Trump administration and the White House were consulted by the Israelis on their attacks in Gaza tonight. And as President Trump has made it clear, Hamas, the Houthis, Iran, all those who seek to terrorize not just Israel, but also the United States of America, will see a price to pay. All hell will break loose. And all of the terrorists in the Middle East, again, the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, Iranian-backed terror proxies, and Iran themselves should take President Trump very seriously when he says he is not afraid to stand for law-abiding people. He is not afraid to stand up for the United States of America and our friend and our ally Israel. And we know that these successful defensive strikes that took place over the weekend against the Houthis in the Red Sea were indeed successful. We took out some of their leaders, and the Defense Department is set to continue with this campaign if the Houthis continue with their retaliatory measures. The president is going to stand for the navigation, freedom of navigation of our seas, which is a very basic principle that unfortunately the previous administration refused to stand for, and that's why we are in this mess in the Middle East in the first place. President Trump inherited a lot of problems, Sean, because of the incompetence and the weakness of the Biden-Harris administration, but he is focused on fixing them, and our allies and our adversaries better take him seriously.
Acting U.S. Ambassador to the UN Dorothy Shea placed the blame for the resumed conflict squarely on Hamas, accusing the group of rejecting all ceasefire proposals.
The blame for the resumption of hostilities lies solely with Hamas. This brutal terrorist organization has steadfastly refused every proposal and deadline they've been presented over the past few weeks, including a bridge proposal to extend the ceasefire beyond Ramadan and Passover, to allow time to negotiate a framework for a permanent ceasefire. Hamas refused this offer, preferring still to hold hostages captive and hide amongst the people of Gaza, using them as human shields. It is the people of Gaza who will suffer further because of Hamas's disregard for human life. Madam President, in this context, I want to respond to the allegation of indiscriminate attacks by the IDF. The IDF is striking Hamas positions. It is well known that Hamas continues to use civilian infrastructure as launching pads, and the United States condemns this practice, as should others. President Trump has made clear that Hamas must release the hostages immediately or pay a high price, and we support Israel in its next steps. Hamas must release the hostages it abducted more than 17 months ago. Doing so would enable loved ones to be reunited and allow the return of remains for those killed while being held by Hamas. Unfortunately, Hamas has refused all attempts to find a way to extend the ceasefire. It has been weeks since Hamas has released any hostages. We must recognize Hamas's savagery for what it is. This terrorist organization committed the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, raped and engaged in sexual violence toward Israeli hostages and other victims of the attack, released multiple hostages in a condition reminiscent of Holocaust survivors, and murdered and then paraded the coffins of the Bibas children through the streets. President Trump has been clear. All of the remaining 59 hostages, including New Jersey resident Edan Alexander and the bodies of 4 Americans murdered by Hamas, Itai Chen, Gadi Haggai, Judy Weinstein Haggai, and Omer Nutra, must be immediately released. Behind every terrorist group like Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, behind every act of violence, behind everything that threatens peace and stability for the millions of people who call this region home, is Iran. The countries of the Middle East have an historic opportunity to reshape their region in a way that affords all its people a better path forward. Stronger ties between Israel and its neighbors offer an alternative to Iran's malign influence and state sponsorship of terror. The United States will do its part with our Arab partners to work toward a durable solution to the conflict and create a more prosperous future for the region's people. Thank you.
The Hostages and Missing Families Forum, which represents Israeli families with loved ones held by Hamas, expressed shock and anger at the government's decision to resume military action. The group criticized Israel for abandoning efforts to secure the return of hostages. In Yemen, the Houthi rebels pledged to escalate their support for Palestinians in response to Israel's airstrikes. The Houthis condemned the attacks and reaffirmed their support for the Palestinian cause. The Palestinian Islamic Jihad group also condemned Israel's actions, accusing it of sabotaging efforts for a lasting ceasefire. Iran held the United States accountable for the continuation of violence in Palestine, calling it a direct responsibility for the genocide in the occupied territories. Saudi Arabia also condemned Israel's actions, describing them as a direct attack on unarmed civilians in Gaza. Jordan's government spokesperson denounced Israel's bombing campaign, stressing the urgent need to stop the aggression. Pakistan called on the UN Security Council Tuesday to demand a halt to the genocidal war in the enclave and implementation of the 15th of January ceasefire agreement.
Madam President, we are at another tragic milestone in the war in Gaza and the occupied Palestinian territories. This war and the manner in which the Security Council and the international community respond to the atrocities and actions that have been taken will have a lasting impact on the nature of the world order which we and succeeding generations inherit. 50,000 plus people have been killed in Gaza, 150,000 injured, and 2/3 of them have been women and children. Attacks on hospitals, schools, mosques, civilian centers. Every principle, every article of international law and international humanitarian law have been blatantly violated with impunity. Defying the resolutions of the General Assembly, of the Security Council, of the International Court of Justice. Unless the international community responds with justice to what has happened and is happening in the occupied Palestinian territories, our world order is likely to regress into the barbarism from which the Charter of the United Nations was supposed to rescue us. Madam President, the agreement of 15th January for a ceasefire, for a three-phase ceasefire.
In Turkey, the government said that Israel's airstrikes marked a new phase in its policy of genocide against Palestinians. Turkey condemned Israel's hostile approach and its potential to undermine the future of the Middle East. Egypt, acting as a mediator, called the airstrikes a flagrant violation of the ceasefire, warning that it could destabilize the entire region. Qatar strongly condemned the attacks, with its Ministry of Foreign Affairs warning that Israel's escalating policies could ignite regional conflict. China expressed deep concern, urging all parties to avoid actions that could further escalate the situation and result in a larger humanitarian disaster.
中方高度关注当前的巴以局势，希望各方能够切实推动停火协议连续有效执行，避免采取任何可能导致局势升级的举动，防止造成更大规模的人道主义灾难。
Russia's Kremlin warned of a spiral of escalation in the aftermath of the airstrikes, with concerns about the rising civilian casualties. France called for an immediate halt to the hostilities, stressing that the strikes were jeopardizing efforts to free hostages and endanger civilians in Gaza. The United Kingdom urged both Israel and Hamas to return to the ceasefire agreement, emphasizing the need for dialogue and an end to the violence. In Ireland, Prime Minister Michael Martin condemned the airstrikes, calling for an urgent end to all hostilities for the sake of Gaza's civilians. Belgium called on both parties to implement the second phase of the ceasefire agreement, which is meant to pave the way for peace and reconstruction. The country also criticized Israel's blockade of humanitarian aid. Italy expressed concern that Israel's actions risk derailing efforts to release captives and end hostilities permanently. In Spain, Foreign Minister José Manuel Albares condemned the airstrikes and the indiscriminate targeting of civilians. Germany's Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock expressed grave concern over the escalating violence, particularly the impact on refugee camps. The Netherlands called for an immediate end to hostilities, urging all parties to respect the terms of the ceasefire and to ensure the protection of civilians. Norway's Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre described the airstrikes as a great tragedy for Gaza civilians, many of whom are living in ruins. Switzerland called for a return to the ceasefire, the release of all hostages, and unhindered humanitarian aid to reach Gaza. The United Nations condemned the attacks, with Secretary-General Antonio Guterres expressing shock over the civilian casualties. UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Volker Turk warned that Israel's use of military force would only add more misery to the already suffering Palestinian population. The Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE, condemned Israel's airstrikes as horrific and genocidal, accusing Prime Minister Netanyahu of choosing violence over peace negotiations. Save the Children's humanitarian director in Gaza called the collapse of the ceasefire a death sentence for children, especially given the denial of aid during Ramadan. And Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese called on all parties to respect the ceasefire and continue working toward peace and security in the region. As tensions rise in Gaza, the world watches closely, hoping for a return to peace and a resolution to the ongoing conflict.